Hello, we're live. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers. I am a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for very, very, very many reasons. This is just an open conversation. It's a live stream. I'm here for an hour a week to talk to whoever's here about whatever whoever's here wants to talk about. I pick a topic to get started on just so that there's not pressure or weird silence when people hop in. But we'll go wherever. Those of you who are here watching us, I appreciate you being here. And I don't know if I mentioned this enough or at all, really. So I want to make sure to say, those of you who are watching this stuff afterwards, when you're not here live, I appreciate that as well. I hope that it's helpful. I'm glad to know that some people find it at least worth spending some time with. For those of you who are here, you impact me. Even if you don't talk in the chat, of course, then it's just my idea of who you might be. But yeah, I'm not talking to myself. We're talking into the void. I have an imagined idea of who might be listening and what might they find helpful, which guides my thoughts. If you participate in the chat, then you can have more control and impact over specifically, rather than me just making guesses. You can tell me what you're here and what you're thinking about and what you ask questions or whatever. So we'll go where we go. We're just going to start with a topic. We don't have to stay on that topic. I run an individual therapy and executive functioning coaching practice called Effective Artistry. That's our logo up in the corner. We are in Northbrook, Illinois, where it's 90-something degrees outside, which I love and wish I was outside. Am I missing anything? I don't know. Maybe. That's the extent of what I was able to remember. Not so good at the logistics stuff. I'm good at the ideas and conversation and philosophy and the work, not the business. Anyway, here's what's on my mind right now. So this is what I'm going to start by talking about, but we'll go wherever we go. I try not to say people's names. So if you're talking in the chat, I might reference your comments, but I'll try not to say your name. I don't really know why. Maybe that's a silly rule, because just so that you know, these things are saved as VOD, video on demand, a YouTube video or whatever, basically, on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Twitch. And I think it saves your comments as well, including like when they were made. So maybe it's silly not to say people's names. I'll have to think about that. It seems silly. I should just say people's names, but I don't want to rush into that. I might be missing something right now in this moment. But if you're on Facebook and you make a comment, it'll be attached to your Facebook account. Your name from your Facebook account will be on it. If it's on YouTube, it'll be your Google account. If it's on Twitch, it's your Twitch account. Just keep that in mind if you're wanting to talk about anything that you don't want connected to those accounts. Not that there's been much experience of that, I think. I haven't seen much of people talking about things that they might be, maybe, I don't know. Who knows what people might be embarrassed to have associated with their name. Yeah, it's more fun for me to have people in the chat. I like to think of this as a conversation. Yeah, okay. So what I'm going to start with today is, specifically, I want to talk about interoception, which is a sense, like hearing, like sight, etc. But I think it's probably, to talk about that more effectively, it's better to start by talking about sensation just generally, to like set the foundation, and then specifically get into interoception and why that's a particular one I want to talk about. So just to clarify, when we're talking about sensation, we're talking about data that is picked up by sensory organs, which are designed in order to pick up that data. Meaning there's sound, which physically speaking, and I'm not a physicist by any means, but this is going to be a rough understanding of this stuff. But sound is a physical wave that travels through the air or whatever medium it is that is conducting the sound waves, water or whatever it's going through. There's actual detectable waves in those things. And our ears are designed, evolved, however you want to say it, to be receptive to those waves. And then at the end of that, the sensory organ is the ear, It's connected by by nerves to the brain so that it can pass that information. It takes the sound waves, translates it into electrical impulses that it can send to the brain, which then you can perceive. You don't, and this is important, you don't actually perceive the vast majority of what your sensory organs are detecting, because we can't consciously be aware of everything. We have very limited space, working memory it's called, or consciousness or awareness or whatever. We have very limited space to be conscious of something, aware of something. So the vast majority of what sense data your sensory organs are picking up, you don't notice. A lot of that your body does utilize. It just bypasses consciousness, right? That if I am taking a sip of my tea, that there is sense data being picked up by my skin, and actually proprioception is probably also involved here, that I am not conscious of the exact specific details. I cannot be conscious of picking up the tea at all, and my body still utilizes that information. It still uses the visual, even though I'm not paying attention. Like when you drive, for those of you who drive, if you drive a route that you've driven many, many, many times before and you just stop paying attention altogether, obviously your sensory organs, your eyes and your ears and your hands and are still picking up data that your brain is then utilizing to instruct, how do you move your muscles and push on the brake and whatever, even though you're not consciously paying attention to it. So sense data means any of that physical stimuli that could theoretically be picked up by a sensory organ. Sensation is referring to your specific what of that sense data is picked up by your sensory organs. And then perception, well, probably better to say attention, because perception is a little more complicated. Attention is the process which dictates of all that sense data what gets noticed. Because perception is, I don't think it's as easy to say it's in that specific process. Perception starts in the nerve endings, apparently. I don't know. I read that research, or I read the findings of that research. I didn't read the actual research itself, so I don't know what the specifics of that are. It's a very interesting field of scientific inquiry from what I do know of it. This idea of how can our brains and bodies possibly be taking in data, doing something with it, and putting things out in that quick of a time. How the perception piece, how do we distinguish what a thing is and how to respond to it, like constantly, moment to moment. Anyway, just the point there is that you sense more things than you actually notice, and different things dictate of all the stuff you sense. What do you actually notice? What does enter into awareness? Gets through that attention process. Yeah, I don't need to say more than that probably about that. So we all learn about the five. Well, I shouldn't say we all. My experience and the people that I know, especially in the United States, is that in elementary school, you learn about the five senses: sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. And those are important ones. They're not at all the only ones. Those ones are good to know about because they're distinguished by the type of data, right? That light entering through my, pupil, hitting my rods and cones in the back and blah, blah, blah. That's a different thing. Sound is a wave. Light is, I don't actually know. I don't actually even know if it's like a settled thing. I think some people think it's photons and so, I don't know, but it's something different. Gustatory, sense of taste, is a different thing. It's not waves. It's not light, photons, or whatever that is. Same with smell. It's different pieces of data, and those five are the five that have the most to do with sensing data from the external world. Because there's a lot more senses than that, but as far as I know, the rest of them that we might talk about involve a sense of your own body, not just translating signals from external to your body. I'm talking through this. I'm revealing to myself some areas that I want to explore and get more information about, because I don't know that that's actually why we talk about that. That's just my idea of why we talk about those five as though they're the only five. But some of the others, Interoception, we're going to talk a lot about today. Well, we'll see, but probably. Interoception is the sense of the state of the body internally. So not what we might call metacognition, where it's how am I feeling? I'm checking in with myself. What am I thinking? What are my emotions? But literally, on your bladder, there are nerve endings that can translate data about how full or empty is the bladder, and on your stomach. And I'm sure that I am not saying that correctly anatomically, but we have nerve endings inside of our body that can detect the physical state of something. Meaning I can say I'm feeling angry, and that's a good observation because it's true, because I'm feeling angry. I'm not right now, but if you were, theoretically. But there's no way for somebody else, even theoretically, to be able to determine that you are, in fact, angry. Whereas I could say, oh, my stomach is really full. And theoretically, if we were to somehow look in there, we could see physically, yes, the stomach is full, or is not, because you might be perceiving it inaccurately. But there's actual physical data there. We just can't detect it because it's inside of somebody's body. I am probably being way more complicated than is necessary about all this. So that's interoception. Proprioception is the sense we have of how parts of our body are organized relative to each other, right? That even if I had no visual or auditory or tactile or gustatory or olfactory data, the five, I would still have a sense of my hand is higher now than it was a moment ago. I can detect that without having to use those external senses. We call that proprioception. There's the vestibular sense, which is about your relationship to gravity, balance, right? When you spin around and get dizzy, that's because you're messing with the vestibular. I'm realizing that I don't know the right terms. The sense is called the vestibular sense. I think it's stuff in the ears that detects that balance, relationship to gravity. And I don't know. I want to say that it's like that it's basically like a level, that there's some liquid there, and because it's liquid, as you shift your relationship to gravity, it always settles to the lowest point, which then translates into you knowing which way is down, unless you're like, underwater or whatever. But I don't know what that's called, except that whatever that organ is might also be called a vestibular or something. Anyway. And then there's also things that, as far as I know, are not quite as settled, like sensing electromagnetic things and that kind of stuff. I don't know how, maybe there's a lot of consensus about it or not. I don't know. Just there are definitely people who talk about senses in different ways and will add some that other people will say, no, that's not a sense, and that kind of stuff. Certainly, I should clarify, I'm not talking about like ESP kind of senses. I'm talking about stuff that there, at least theoretically, exists physically. Although I suppose many people's theories about ESP and that kind of stuff, I don't know. That's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about is interoception. And in particular, I want to talk about it because I think that a lot of neurodivergent people have what I would say deprioritized interoception. That we have finite ability to notice things, right? And those attentional processes, whatever they are, whatever the specifics are that dictate what things get passed into attention or through attention into awareness and what doesn't, those processes prioritize things. If you have a sensitivity to a particular type of data, it means that process for you tends to prioritize that type of data categorically. That's our guess based on your experiences of what you've noticed and what causes you distress and all that. If we say you have an auditory sensitivity, we mean your brain for some reason is passing along the auditory data into consciousness in some way that seems disproportionate to what is useful. You're getting more of it. If you have hyposensitivity, meaning undersensitive, it's the opposite. We're saying it seems as though you get that data less than would be helpful optimally. Everybody has senses that they prioritize or deprioritize. It's not just clinical hypersensitivities or hyposensitivities. There's a cutoff point at which a clinician will say, yes, this is a diagnosable condition. But just normally, day to day, people, everybody, we have some things we notice more and some things we notice less. I have a terrible sense of smell, not a great palate. pretty good with hearing. I don't know. Everybody has their stuff. And interoception specifically, I have noticed a pattern of people seeming to get less data from interoception than would otherwise seem helpful. Specifically, what I'm talking about, a couple different things, is noticing and acting on in order to rectify any issues with thirst, hunger, need to use the bathroom, need to sleep. There's something else that I was wanting to say specifically about interoception. Oh, the passage of time. This is a big one. Let's start with that one. Why not? Nobody's saying anything in the chat yet, so I'm just going to talk about whatever sounds interesting to me. Because this is kind of, it might be other people's theories. I don't know. Maybe there's data out there, but this is just an idea that I have that makes sense to me and seems useful, so I'll share it. Which is that one of the primary ways that humans are able to note the passage of time is through interoceptive data. So there are external things that we can observe that help us note the passage of time, right? Like the movement of the sun in the sky, or the temperature as the day warms up and the night cools down. Of course, we have at this point all kinds of artificial ways of monitoring. I have a clock there and a clock there, and I have a watch on and a phone that can beep at me. So there's plenty of ways to monitor the passage of time externally. But if any of you have heard of circadian rhythm, we know that there is obviously something that if you put a person into a room where they cannot have any of that data, the light doesn't change, the temperature doesn't change, there's no clocks, none of that stuff, that the body still seems to follow some kind of temporal cycle, time-based cycle. We call it the circadian rhythm, meaning that you wake for a while and you sleep for a while, and you wake for a while and you sleep for a while. You eat when you're hungry, and then time passes and you get hungry again and you eat again, and so on. And I don't know, again, the specific data. I know the findings that have been publicized, but I don't have anything more than pop science here than whatever you guys probably have access to as well. That circadian rhythm seems to be, interestingly, not directly correlated to the 24-hour day. That, if I recall, it's something like 25 hours. So over time, if you're removed from any external markers of time, over time, your day, you get an hour off of what the clock time would be. Without that external signal to keep you grounded on that 24-hour day, one day you go to bed at 7, the next day you go to bed at 8, the next day you go to bed at 9, and so on and so forth. But it feels to you like you're going to bed at the same time every day. Which actually just made me think of some interesting stuff about sleep. But anyway, so the theory is, anyway, that interoceptive data is how we do that internal time marking, that as our stomach empties out and we become hungry, as our bladder fills up and we need to use the bathroom, as we get tired and need to sleep, that we're monitoring those changes, and those changes can only happen over time, and theoretically should be relatively some kind of a predictable pattern of you, for yourself specifically, not as compared to other people, can monitor, because there's been this much change in how hungry I am, it equates or correlates in some way to about how much time has passed. So people use the phrase time blindness, which is not the greatest phrase, partly because it's ableist, partly because it's misleading, more because it's ableist. Especially when talking about ADHD, people will use the term time blindness to say more or less that people with ADHD don't notice the passage of time. Some people will go that far to actually literally say, which I think is ridiculous to say literally, but I don't know, maybe it's true for other people's experiences, that without some reminder, external reminder, they don't notice the passage of time at all. I think a more helpful way to talk about it is that it's a decreased awareness as compared to the norm of the passage of time, or an inaccurate or less accurate awareness of the passage of time. I know time has passed. I just thought it was 10 minutes and it was actually 40. Not that I thought time was standing still or ceased to exist. So people have proposed the term time agnosia, a lack of awareness of time. But I don't like that as a lot either, because it's deficit based. It's the idea is you are in some way less capable of or less equipped to notice the passage of time. There's something broken, missing. But what the neurodiversity paradigm is all about is that there's more than one side to everything. That if there's a variation, a non-pathological variation in the way that humans are, then there must be some situational advantage or disadvantage. No, there must be both situational advantages and disadvantages to that way of being. Otherwise, theoretically, we would all evolve in whatever way was considered optimal. We wouldn't have that variation, right? Like humans don't vary, generally speaking, except for in cases of terms of injury or illness. We don't vary in the number of eyes we have or the number of arms and legs. You know, there's mutations, but generally speaking, we do vary in height. And that theoretically is because while it's always optimal to have binocular vision, and it doesn't always happen, but that's because of pathology, injury or illness. But except in those cases, everybody has binocular vision. Well, people are different heights. That doesn't have anything to do with injury or illness. It's just a natural, non-pathological variation that would only theoretically make sense if sometimes it's better to be tall and sometimes it's better to be short. So it's good for a community or for the species to have members which fulfill both those roles, so that we can specialize within a community and help each other survive, because that's what humans' evolutionary advantage is communication and cooperation, social skills. Oh, I'm so off base. Somebody say something in the chat. Anyway, so if some people seem to prioritize interoceptive data more than other people, then there must be some benefit to prioritizing it less. So that's why I call it deprioritized. It just means you don't prioritize it as highly. I think probably the benefit more than anything is just that you're prioritizing other senses, other things you notice more. And because those resources are finite, in response, something has to be noticed less. If I am more sensitive to auditory data than the average person, then theoretically, there's some other type of data that I am less sensitive to, or all other type of data I'm less sensitive to in some way. But maybe not. I don't know. It's all just theories. So that struggle to note the passage of time accurately, in especially people with ADHD, but certainly not exclusively, seems to correlate with other things that would make sense as deprioritized interoception. That here are very common complaints, especially from people with ADHD, but definitely not exclusively. I think a lot of this is common in autism as well, and many other things. And it doesn't all have to have a clinical diagnosis attached to it. It's just ways that people vary. Other things that seem to correlate to that would be explained by deprioritized interoception. I don't notice when I'm thirsty. I don't drink enough water. I don't notice when I'm hungry. I don't eat enough food. If I'm busy at work, I'll go 12 hours in a day without even thinking about eating until all of a sudden I'm like, oh gosh, I'm so hungry. And on the flip side, sometimes I eat a lot. Like I just keep eating until my stomach hurts, which would theoretically then be on the other side. I'm not getting a sense of my stomach being full, until it's so bad. I notice my hunger eventually, but not until it's real bad. I notice that I'm full eventually, but not until it's real bad. I notice that I need to pee or use the bathroom eventually, but not until it's real bad. And then people have a tendency to deal with, or maybe it's not, and then maybe it's, I don't know, chicken and egg. But people also then have people who are experiencing that seem to also have an experience of dealing with these things conceptually. That I eat not because I'm hungry, but because it's time to eat. And I stop eating not because I am no longer hungry, but because I have eaten the appropriate amount of food. Or I eat not because I'm hungry, but because I want to eat. And one thing that can be especially confusing here is that you're still going to call that hunger. So we don't generally have language to talk about these things. So I'll use myself as an example. There have been many, many times in my life, especially more when I was younger. It doesn't happen as much these days because I've done a lot to try and address it. But I have gotten to the point where the first sign of hunger that I notice is my hand shaking, my fingers shaking. There have been many times, and people can back me up on this as though you guys would care about having evidence. Uh, there have been many times where I'll look at it and even in that moment be not noticing any physical sensation of hunger, just being like, oh, I must need food. But of course, I haven't thought of myself my whole life as somebody who doesn't get hungry. I just used that term hunger to define what I thought what it was meant to define, and I assumed everybody else was the same. And not until really only a couple of years ago did I find out that other people mean different things, at least sometimes. For me, saying hungry means I want to eat. And the reason that I want to eat doesn't matter. Sometimes saying I'm hungry is because I'm looking at something that looks delicious and I want to eat it. And I'm saying, yeah, I'm hungry. Sometimes I'm saying I'm hungry because I might be bored or understimulated, and I rely on snacking and crunching, especially small things that you can take a small bite and crunch as a way to get that stimulation. So I'll say I'm hungry. Or I might say that I'm hungry because I notice that I'm in a foul mood and I'm irritable. And my theory is that I'm irritable because I'm hungry. So I say I'm hungry. And I don't think any of that is necessarily very off. I just didn't realize until pretty recently that some people, at least when they say they're hungry, what they mean is there's a physical sensation that they're detecting of emptiness in there. And of course, I've felt that from time to time, but I just thought that was like one piece of all this. And it probably is. I don't know. I don't know what everybody means when they say hunger. That's kind of the point of talking about it. It makes sense to me that some people would have such good interoceptive processes that they wouldn't need to learn to deal with hunger in that conceptual kind of a way, that they would just respond, notice, and respond very moment to moment and intrinsically to the condition of their body. It makes sense to me that some people wouldn't learn to think about hunger in that way because they've just always had a certain meal schedule that meant that they never really got hungry. First, their parents gave them food at the right time so that they never experienced much hunger. And then later on, they just continued those routines. I don't know. But I know that I can make some guesses that seem to hit a lot for people with ADHD, especially, but neurodivergent people generally. Things like there are times when, well, I said one already, when you are busy and engaged in whatever it is that you're doing, whether that's work or something fun or whatever, and you'll forget to eat and you'll forget to drink water. I'm literally holding a cup of tea in my hand. I have a water glass here and one of these that I just recently got with the time markers to have a visual cue of, not to remind me, but just so that when I do think like, oh, I should drink, I can look and say, how much have I drank, right? I have all that here. And as I'm talking to you, the reason I started saying that is because my mouth feels dry. But rather than stop for a second and take a sip, I'm engaged in what I'm trying to say. I'm tracking my thoughts and the concepts. And I can't really be bothered to stop even for a moment to address the fact that my mouth feels dry and it's uncomfortable to keep talking. I think this also kind of correlates, at least anecdotally, to people who don't seem to prioritize their own suffering very much. That they just don't notice it or don't put as much weight or value on it or don't care, or however you want to say it, but that they'll be in physically uncomfortable or painful or unsustainable situations and be like, yeah, it's fine. And other people will be physically uncomfortable or in pain or unsafe, and they'll be like, this is awful and I'm going to address it right away. I think there's a lot that goes into that, obviously. But mechanically, I still think that there's probably a role that deprioritized interoception is playing there. That if you were constantly conscious of, I mean, by the time, well, the jokes are, right, that when you're in your 30s or mid 30s or 40s or wherever, then your body just starts to have random aches and pains. And I kind of think people's bodies just always have random, you stubbed your toe and whatever. But imagine if the way that the pain felt in that first moment of it, you stub your toe, and how much does it hurt right away? How aware of it are you? And then it starts to go away. It usually, hopefully, with stubbing your toe, goes away pretty quickly. Within 10, 15, 30 seconds, you're kind of back to a place where it's like, okay, yeah, it still hurts a little bit, but I don't need to pay attention to it anymore. Imagine if you didn't do that. Imagine if that sense of the pain in the first moment, if it stayed that intense, if your attentional processes were passing along that pain into consciousness in that way, like, that would be awful, miserable. And on the flip side, if you don't notice the pain at all, then you don't make whatever adjustments theoretically should be made in order to prevent the problems that the pain is trying to warn about. Because that's what pain is, as a function that it serves. Physical pain is a signal of, hey, something is happening here that you must address, because it's either injuring us or will injure us or killing us or will kill us. You have to address it. It's inherently unpleasant. That's what it is for. It's inherently unpleasant because it's important sometimes to be able to pay it, to not be able to be forced to pay attention to something, whether you want to or not. So if you don't notice it enough, you're probably going to get injured a lot and sick a lot, because you're not noticing enough of the pain and the discomfort to be able to address it. I know for me, I don't like going to the doctor, mostly just because it's a hassle and it's an executive functioning challenge to like schedule something and remember to schedule something, but then remember to block that time. It's just a hassle. So I'll be pretty sick or pretty, dealing with a good amount of pain before I get to the point of, I want to go to the doctor. And truthfully, I really just thought of this in this moment. Usually when I set up a doctor appointment, it's because of emotional distress or anguish, conscious, based on something physical, right? It's not that the pain, I'm like, oh, this pain needs to be addressed. It's that the pain happens and I start to think, what could that be? Oh gosh, could that be something really terrible? Oh no, now I want to go to the doctor so that they can just check out and make sure that I'm okay, that there's not something that I'm missing. That's just my experience, but it probably resonates with people. I don't know. So I just think there's a lot of utility in looking at interoception as a sense, and in looking at hyper and hyposensitivities as things that everybody has relative to other types of data, other types of sensation data, sense data, at least, although I think you can categorize it in more ways than just that. Yeah, I don't like that term, time blindness. It is a weird way. It's both offensive and inaccurate, which, even if it was accurate, it still wouldn't be a good term to continue to use. But it's not accurate. And I don't like inaccurate terminology because it gives people the wrong impression. And then they engage with things, they notice things differently than would be most useful because they're engaging with it in an inaccurate way. If somebody told you that all pain is in your head, that no matter what's happening, pain is just electrical signals going to the brain, all that is true, and that therefore, if you learn certain mental techniques, you can just never feel pain again, which doesn't seem to be true to me, but people make claims. I don't know. Maybe it works for them. But even if that's the case, wouldn't that be a problem? Like, how would you know if something's happening that could be damaging to you? So I think a lot of perception, a lot of these attentional processes can be described in that way. It's trying to ride the balance of notice problematic things enough so that you can address them, but not so much so that you are overwhelmed by the pain or the problems and therefore can't address them. It's like a window of, you need the information. You can't be completely oblivious to the state of what's happening, but you can't be too aware of the negative information specifically. Otherwise, it overwhelms everything and there's not much you can do. In like, especially in regards to autism, but, just in talking about neurodivergence, people tend to be very aware. There's a lot of talk about auditory sensitivities. There's a good amount of talk about olfactory, especially in regards to autism, olfactory and gustatory smell and taste sensitivities. And people will talk about light sensitivity, but there's not generally, as far as what I've seen, there's not a lot of talk about visual sensitivity generally. It's just specifically the intensity of light or the type of light, fluorescent lights, right? And I don't really hear anybody talk about the senses of the body, interoception and all that kind of stuff. I mean, vertigo. Not that I know a lot about it, but isn't that in some way some kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Unhelpful interaction with your sense of balance, the vestibular sense? It's becoming very clear to me that I don't feel confident in discussing all of these terms, which is a good way for me to know. This is part of why verbal processing is helpful. Because when you say things out loud, like I said at the beginning, I'm imagining you guys who are here. I don't know who is here or how many of you there are. I have no way of accessing that data as far as I know. There's probably a way. I've tried to look into it and I couldn't figure it out. I would imagine there's some way to know how many people are watching a thing. I don't. I only know if you talk in the chat or not. So it's just my imagination. But imagining saying this stuff to people is different than just thinking it in my head. And then it reveals things to me of, oh, I don't feel like I'm as effective communicating about this because I'm not confident in my usage of the language, which makes me want to look into that stuff more so that I can become more confident in it. I think talking about sensitivities is hugely important and very useful beyond just the basics of, I mean, most people don't talk about sensitivities at all. Most people who do talk about sensitivities talk about it only in the detrimental sense that, oh, I have an auditory sensitivity is usually only discussed when it means that sounds cause me pain or discomfort, not when we're talking about the depth of detail and the granularity and the specificity of my awareness of sound. When we talk about taste sensitivities, we're talking primarily about people who struggle to eat certain things. Or smell sensitivities, we talk about when people are caused pain or discomfort or feel nauseous based on what they're smelling. Light sensitivities, when I get headaches or fatigue or whatever from the light. We don't generally talk about the other side, which is part of the problem of the deficit model and what neurodiversity is meant to be a response to, is to say, if there's a downside to something that isn't pathological, there's got to be a reason for that. There's got to be an upside as well. Otherwise, why would it exist? If it's an injury or an illness, okay. Or a random mutation, sure. But if it's something widespread across the population, why would that have proliferated if there was never any advantage to it? Theoretically, anyway. I'm feeling a little bit adrift. I'm sure that is probably noticeable. Might have some to do with the fact that it is a beautiful day outside and I can see that in the windows. Also, I have a comment in the chat, which I appreciate. Thank you. But only one, so I guess I'm losing track of what might be useful to people. Get practical, Brandon. If you notice those things, especially in terms of interoception, if you notice that you seem to have trouble accurately noting the passage of time unless you have consistent external reminders, if you notice that you seem to consistently drink less water, eat less food, or drink more water, or eat more food than seems necessary, if you consistently, I mean, here's a specific experience I've thrown out to a lot of people. Again, maybe it's universal. I don't know. I've mostly talked about it with neurodivergent people, that I don't always just pee when I need to pee. I pee because, I'm about to watch a movie and I don't want to have to go later, so I have to go now. Or I'm about to go to bed and I don't want to have to get out of bed, so I have to go now. And then sometimes you'll pee and then go get in bed, and then 5 minutes later you're like, oh no, I have to pee again, even though you don't. And when you go, there's nothing there. Because that perception of that sense is not exactly correlated with what is actually happening physically inside of your body. The greater that disparity, I don't think anybody has a perfect sense. They know exactly what's happening with their body at all times and never have to think about it or cause problems by it. But I think there's an intensity of difference, right? How closely linked is your awareness of your interoception, to what you're actually, and how far away. And the more it causes you problems, and I would say the thing I probably hear more than anything is in terms of water. People will talk all the time about, I forgot to drink water. I never drink enough water. I can never remember to drink water. So that's a good sign that maybe this thinking will be relevant. Just know, if that's the case, theoretically, there are things you can do over time to start to prioritize that data more, get your attention to prioritize it more. Certainly that can be done. But it is not going to happen by just saying, I got to try harder to remember. And every time you say that to yourself, I got to try harder to remember to drink water, you're just going to feel worse the next time you forget, but you will forget again. This is one of those things we talk about both in terms of neurodiversity and executive functioning is observe how you operate, observe how your brain and body seem to work when you don't force them consciously to do things other than what they do by default. What is that default way of being? And then build your life as much as possible so that it works for that default way of being. So you don't have to constantly be putting in mental effort to override your default responses to things and say, remember to drink water, remember to drink water. That, yeah, I have a hard time tracking the passage of time accurately. I know that I run sessions long, I'm late to things, it's a problem. And longtime watchers of the stream will know I just added that, how can I put it? Aha, that clock up, I don't know, a month or two ago, so that I would have a clock in the actual field of view of this, even though I also have a big digital clock right now on my second monitor that I always set up so that I'm aware of that. And I also just got a smartwatch because I silence my phone. And so when reminders of, hey, 10 minutes till the hour or whatever comes through, I often miss it. But if it vibrates on my wrist, I'll detect it better. Rather than just saying, I should be better about ending on time. I should be better about starting. I mean, I've said that a lot. I plan around it. I put things in my environment. This is going to sound silly, but I have actually found this to be very helpful in multiple instances. If you struggle to wake up in the morning and you use an alarm clock, if the alarm clock is sound, try getting an alarm clock that uses visual, that uses light. Try getting an alarm clock that uses vibration, that you put under the mattress and shakes the bed, or that you wear a watch that vibrates on your wrist. Just try it. It might not do anything. And I know that there's resources involved. You have to pay money to get the new alarm clock. But I think there's some that's not that expensive. So if it's something that you can afford to try, give it a try. And I have on multiple occasions seen people who have struggled with waking up in the morning for a decade or more. That has been this big intractable problem for them. And they get an alarm clock that brightens up the room instead of makes a sound. And waking up is no longer an issue. It's weird how here's the problem about talking without listening. It's not inherently bad, but you're responding to your own thoughts. And so I'm building on stuff, which is cool. I can develop and come up with things if I can build on my own thoughts. We all do this. But without anybody else or anything else interrupting me, my thoughts build and build on themselves, which means I might come up with some really cool things, but whatever I come up with is pretty distant from where I started. That shared reality of like, nah, you're getting off into things that are unuseful or specific to you or whatever. I don't have that information. So instead, I'm trying to deal with it conceptually and just say, does this sound weird? Does this sound useful? And then I get in my head and I'm sharing this all out loud, partly because it's what's happening and I'm processing it, but partly because I think it might be helpful to some people, at least, to know that I can describe my experience in terms that might resonate with their experience as well. Doesn't mean it's the same, but anyway. So I'm getting more and more self-conscious as time goes on, because I know it's been longer and longer since I last had input from somebody else to check me, to remind me of how what I'm saying might be received and whether it's interesting or ridiculous or whatever. Interesting. I don't usually get very self-conscious on the stream, and I'm not super self-conscious. I don't mind being visible and vulnerable. I think it's important. I think that yeah, well, I appreciate the apology, but didn't mean to imply that you are failing me somehow by not chatting more than you are. I'm just relaying my experience because I really do think A bunch of different thoughts just ran through my head. I'll try and share as much of them as I can. Because I was thinking about how humans learn, how we grow and how we develop, which is primarily through observation and experience, right? We mimic, we see what other people do, and then we mimic it. And I say see, I mean observe, not just visually, although visual is certainly a big part of it. I think it's probably safe to say that on average, people are more sensitive to visual and auditory data than they are to olfactory and gustatory data. I think that's probably safe to say. And I think part of the reason for that is that we observe other people primarily through sight and sound, not as much through taste and smell. Touch maybe somewhere in the middle there. I don't know. Depends, I suppose. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. I was going to talk about mirror neurons and perception. And the basic point I'm trying to make is we know what to do. We respond to things primarily in two ways. One, we have stuff that's built into our genetic code. We call those things reflexes or instincts, right? That when you put something here on a baby, the Moro reflex means that they'll turn their face and try to suckle. That's just built in. They didn't learn that from experience, just a default response to stimuli, that if I get hit, I'm going to flinch away from it and protect that area. It's just built in. Or by observing what other people do and then mimicking it. It's, I think, one of the most fascinating things about the brain is we don't have a built-in mechanism that distinguishes the difference between we're aware of an experience because we're watching somebody else or listening or observing somebody else have that experience versus we ourselves are having that experience. We obviously can distinguish that using logic and using reality checking, but there's not some like intrinsic data in that. Basically, you see something happening to somebody else, it feels at least in some way as though it's happening to you until you find ways to be able to distinguish that. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but when you see somebody get hit, do you flinch? Even if it's fake, like in a movie, and you know intellectually that it's fake, when you see someone get hit, sometimes you go, oh. When you see someone be in a terribly socially awkward and embarrassing situation, even when it's fake, like in a show or a movie, even when intellectually you know that they are specifically manufacturing what looks like a socially awkward situation, an embarrassing situation, even though it's made up and the actors are just pretending, but because it comes across viscerally as though it is that, do you get embarrassed when you see somebody else do something embarrassing? Do you even sometimes cringe? Oh, I can't do this. This is too awkward, too embarrassing. We do actually feel to some extent, and it varies person to person, but also domain to domain, as though we're experiencing what we're observing other people experience. And theoretically, that's a lot about learning. I think there's other value to empathy, the ability to understand what some version of what somebody else might be experiencing or what you might feel in their shoes or whatever. But a lot of it is about learning. If I tell you, if you've never played golf before and I put a golf club in your hand and I put a ball on a tee and I say, okay, you're supposed to hit this ball as hard as you can down that direction. If you just have to do it with no prior knowledge or experience, including no observation of anybody else doing it, versus if you are in that same situation, but I say, watch this person do it 5 times and then do it. When you do it after watching someone else do it 5 times, you will do a better job of it than if you just do it on your own with no observation of other people. So we learn by observing other people. This is why modeling is so important. That concept, what are you modeling or what was modeled for you? Because we don't have the intellectual capability, well, ever, but especially not when we're babies and young children, to distinguish, well, why would someone do what they're doing? Or what's the reasoning? Or what's the context? We just see what's happening. Observe. I keep saying see. Observe what's happening and do the same thing, at least to the best of our ability. And as long as doing the same thing that we've observed doesn't cause us a problem, we don't stop. It's only when doing our best version, our best ability to mimic what we've observed, when doing that causes some problem, that then we pay attention and think, okay, maybe there's a different way to do this. Why did I start talking about this? Modeling and then play. Tell my former workplace that, please. I'd be happy to. I don't know who they are, but I'll tell. I mean, I'm telling anybody who wants to listen right now. That's why I was starting to say it. Is because especially in like the helping professions, therapists and teachers and doctors and coaches, and there is a tendency to think that whether you are the professional or the person looking to get help from the professional, there's a tendency in our culture to assume that the value of that person, the extent to which they can be helpful to you, the extent to which you can be helpful to a client or a student or whatever, is correlated to how well you have gotten your stuff figured out. At least the stuff that is directly associated with what you're trying. If you're trying to teach someone how to play football, you should be a good football player. If you're trying to do therapy, you should have your own mental health situation figured out. And that's a terrible idea, I think. A terrible idea, especially in therapy, which is the field I know best, so I'll focus on that. But I think this is true generally. If you think that you need to project an image of, I've got my stuff together and I don't struggle, I'm an expert, I know what I'm doing, I am professional, and I would never, ever make a mistake or say something incorrect or reveal a lack of knowledge or admit that I'm scared or out of my depth or whatever, right? If we think that any of those things in some way detract from my ability to be helpful to you, and vice versa, if a client is thinking, wow, my therapist said they don't know the answer to this question, how can they really be helpful to me? Which I think is probably less common than therapists putting it on themselves. Well, then what does that mean? That means that either you try to change yourself to be someone who never experiences any of those things, which just won't happen. That's not possible for a person never to make mistakes or be wrong or not know something or feel sad, or you just hide that stuff from the other people, or some combination. You try to have it, not experience it much, but when it does, you hide it. And so it leads to this kind of, and I should say that I think the point of systemic thinking, the point of looking at the influence and power of systems, is not to say that anybody that participates in that system is culpable for the effects of that system. The point is to say that there are things that make it so that even the best that you can do still ends up being harmful to yourself and or other people. The point of saying that something is a bad system or a harmful system, the point of talking about a system at all, is to say that what matters is more than just what an individual is doing. That what an individual is doing is shaped by the context of the system. So I just want to say, I'm not trying to come after individuals here. I'm talking about the system. So I'm pointing out, well, it makes sense why someone would think this. It makes sense why someone would do this. It makes sense. And even though all those things make sense, at the end of it, here's a result. It makes sense why therapists would want, and clients would both want to have this idea of professionalism. There should be some professionalism. You are being paid for one, so you're literally a professional. But we want boundaries. We want ethical guidelines. We want a sense of safety. People going into a situation where they're supposed to be vulnerable, which is what you're intending to do in therapy. You can't really be vulnerable without any assurance or belief that it is safe. Vulnerability requires safety. If you're trying to force someone to be vulnerable, even though they don't feel safe, that's harmful. You have to make people feel safe so that they can be vulnerable, or do what you can anyway to try and help people to feel safe. So it's good. It makes sense. And it makes sense, and I understand why that would include things like don't talk about your own personal business. You're not there for your sake. You're there for the client's sake. They're the one that's paying and you're the one. That makes sense. All these things make sense. And they also extrapolate and, patterns play out, and ends up with things like some therapists who won't allow themselves to drink water during session because they think it's unprofessional. And the modeling is the problem then. That if I am behaving in a way, intentionally, consciously, I'm trying to project to you an image of somebody who has no faults, no flaws, no struggles, that I am an expert and I know things and I can provide. Makes sense why we would do that. You're going to be more willing to listen and try things if you think that I might have some reason, blah, blah, blah. But not all we're doing, but in addition to any of that utility, we're also giving the sense that, hey, look, it's possible for people to never have any struggles or flaws, because look, I'm one of them. You interact with somebody who never has any flaws or struggles or shortcomings. So it's possible. And therefore, every time you struggle or make a mistake or notice a flaw, that's not necessary to the human condition. You're just doing something wrong or you're built wrong, as opposed to the reality of the fact that it's just how it is. And it ends up or it contributes to or results in a culture of people presenting their brand rather than their vulnerability. That what I'm trying to do, what people are trying to do, is convince you to listen to them, convince you to come work with them, which again makes sense and still guides what you choose to share and what not. So I have a specific objection to that way of going about things, which conveniently, because all of my beliefs are convenient, because why would I hold on to a belief that is inconvenient for myself unless I thought, oh, that has some benefit, in which case, isn't it convenient that it has some benefit? Anyway, I conveniently am very comfortable being vulnerable and flawed and struggling and saying things that are incorrect, which has the convenient result of me feeling comfortable being on stream. But I have to have justified that to myself. Because even with the justification that it is useful and valuable for somebody who is sometimes seen as an expert, because I am a therapist and because I do talk about things and I do theoretically and hopefully, and as far as people report to me, have things to share that are helpful for people. I don't know. I guess I'm trying to deliberately lean into not play it up, or just be honest with, this is what I am. And it's scary and it's vulnerable. And I am aware that some people who would theoretically see this or could theoretically see this are going to be very upset, disagree with me about a lot of things. I might even cause harm to people unintentionally. Maybe something I'm saying genuinely causes harm in a way I don't understand. Maybe something I'm saying gets interpreted in a way that is not what I intended, but causes harm. And even in that case, well, I didn't foresee that it could have been interpreted that way. If I had foreseen it, I could have worded it differently to avoid the potential of that harmful interpretation. It's scary. It's tense. It's not comfortable. But I think it's important. So I don't mind floundering a little bit, I guess. I don't mind rambling. I don't mind criticizing myself out loud or judging myself. Because even though I don't generally like self-judgment, I also acknowledge that there must be a reason that we do it. So I'm not judging myself for the fact that I judge myself. I just say, I judge myself. Interesting. What utility might be there? At least that's what I try. And I fail all the time. And I'm wrong all the time. But that's what I'm going for. Also, specifically with the way this industry works, people being vulnerable with a therapist or trying to select among coaches who might be helpful for them. And there's just not a lot of information available about that. So people overfocus on things like theories and techniques, because what other information do you have about a person? I'm trying to make it so that you have lots of information about me and our work and our philosophy, so that you can decide whether it's something you're interested in or not. I just think it's a little, I don't know, it's hubris to think that we can intellectually understand and explain every component of everything that we do and connect it specifically to the reasons behind it all. It's just way too complicated and nuanced for that. So if I try to do that, if I try to think about how everything I do might be impacted by this or might impact something, if I try to predict, and we do all the time, there's nothing we can do about it. We're going to try to predict how people will respond to us. We're going to try to figure out why we do what we do. And we do that for reasons. There's utility in that. I just think it's important to be aware that even while you're doing that, and knowing that it's okay that you're doing that, know that it's not something you can actually do. It's something that trying to do it has utility, but it can't actually be done. So if I'm giving an inauthentic, if I'm being visible, observable to people in a way that is inauthentic, I can't know what elements I might be missing of what I'm doing, or I can think through it very deeply. And I'm a fantastic liar. I used to be a professional actor. I'm good at communicating. I can make stuff up. I'm pretty good at it. But I don't know. I feel like that just gave me even more of an awareness of the fact that no matter how good you are at it, there's going to be things that you miss. That's why I don't like when people think that they need to intellectually justify their feelings or their desires. It's not to say, oh, everything you feel is good and everything you desire is good. Go right ahead, no problem. It's just, it doesn't need to be justified unless there's some reason that it would be a problem. And then you want to think about, okay, well, is it justifiable in the face of that problem or whatever? But as a default response, people thinking that they need to say, oh, I'm struggling because blank, 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 instead of just being able to say I'm struggling, I think it causes a lot of harm, honestly. Just that's all I'm trying to get at. A lot of people who feel like they can't ask for help unless they know exactly what help they're asking for. I can't just say, I'm sad. I have to say, I'm sad because I'm lonely and I need you to blah, blah, blah. I don't know what I'm talking about. I mean, I know what I'm saying, but floating pretty free at this point. And it's time to wrap up anyway. I am already a little embarrassed about this stream. Not going to take it down. I've had that experience before where I'm like, ooh, I don't like how that came across. And I'm not going to. The whole point of this is that whether I like it or not shouldn't dictate whether it's accessible to people. If it is embarrassing, then people should be allowed to see that it's embarrassing. If it's helpful, even though I find it embarrassing, maybe there's something helpful in it, then cool. I want people to be able to access it for that reason. And if not, if it's just all embarrassing and weird and terrible, I don't want to try and hide it. I don't want to give that. I don't want to model that the only way to be valuable or helpful to people is to never do anything embarrassing or always make perfect sense. But I am already a little embarrassed of this one, and I probably will be pretty intensely embarrassed about this one later on, but it's going to stay up. I appreciate you all being here, those of you who are. I guess I especially appreciate it today because I feel less whatever, all the things I've been saying, I guess. If you're still here and sticking with me, cool. I like to know that. I like to think and hope that there's something useful in this and I'm not just embarrassed and being weird on a camera for no reason. Maybe I am. I don't know. But I like to think that there are people here that enjoy or benefit from this. So thank you for being here. And I'll be here again same time next week, Wednesday, 1 to 2. And honestly, maybe that's a bad time to do it. I picked it for reasons. We don't have time to talk about it. Maybe that's worth talking about at some point, is why we picked this time, why I do it at this time. Because maybe it's a terrible time and I should pick a different time. I don't know. Yeah, thank you. And thank you for your comments. I appreciate it. I'm around. I'll be back next week. Thanks.